Welcome to this very special edition of the KAJ Masterclass Live, the show that ensures that you spend profit from your time spent here with experts, either through their industry insights, information, or simply learning from them. And today we have George Sudarkoff. He's an executive coach for profoundly gifted leaders with ADHD. Welcome to the show, George.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
You are welcome to the show, George. You are welcome to India in this online form. And I'm sure not just in India, but a lot of people across the globe will benefit from what we are going to talk about. We'll be talking about ADHD, leadership, and entrepreneurship. So, first, a lot of people have heard about ADHD, but many people may not even know the full form of it. Many people know somewhat about it, and many people have their own understanding of ADHD. So I want to understand from the basics, from a simple man's perspective, is how would you like to explain ADHD to a general person who is, who should know about these things?
Yeah, so ADHD stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, and it has a few presentations. It could present as somebody not paying attention. That's how it might look to an external observer, or somebody who's very fidgety, hyperactive. And there's a combined presentation when you kind of have both. We used to call this ADD, focusing just on the attention part, and then a few years back, hyperactivity was tacked on to the same diagnosis.
Right, right. So, for a general person, if you look at it, the general person will say that attention deficit. So, attention deficit, now almost everyone is losing on the attention part of it. They say you have got 8 seconds attention, 10 seconds attention. So,
Yeah.
what does that mean? Does it mean that the whole world is suffering from ADHD? How would we understand then if someone gives this reasoning?
Yeah, you can often hear people say that we are all a little ADHD in today's world, and there's some truth to it. But when it comes to a diagnosis, we're trying to take this something that has a spectrum of presentation, and we're trying to come up with a categorical yes, this person has ADHD, and no, this person does not have ADHD. And we need to have this categorical decision because a lot of things in the world out there demand a categorical decision. For example, in the United States, ADHD medication is Schedule II drugs. It's illegal to sell and buy them unless you're diagnosed with something like ADHD. So we need to have this categorical decision. In school, if a child is diagnosed with ADHD, they entitled to certain accommodations, and same at work. So there is a little bit of truth that we're all a little bit of ADHD, but for a person who will have the diagnosis, it crosses some threshold that becomes potentially debilitating condition in life.
Right, right, George. Attention deficit and hyperactivity. How does that happen at the same time? Someone who has lack of attention, I thought maybe they can relax a bit, but how does it lead to hyperactivity when I'm not attentive in anything? Help us understand this part of it. I find it totally two opposite things, but maybe I'm wrong. I want to understand from you, George.
Yeah, attention deficit is not the best name for it. Unfortunately, it creates this illusion, a picture that people with ADHD lack attention, where in reality it means that we pay attention to everything at the same time. and what we lack is the ability to focus on one individual thing. And you can see how hyperactivity can coexist with that. When you see and notice everything, you get distracted, you jump from one thing to another. And the same thing happens with your thinking. There's a default mode network is a network of regions in our brains that normally becomes active when we're not actively engaged in some activity where you need to pay attention, like problem solving. For neurotypical people, it becomes active when your engine is idling, so to speak, when you're in a daydreaming state. But for people with ADHD, this region, the default mode network, is active almost all the time. And so the person with ADHD might experience it as almost like daydreaming while being engaged in a task, in a problem solving, for example. And so you can see how can that lead to getting distracted and presenting as hyperactive person.
Right, right. So, George, help me understand this. Is it from anyone's perspective? Can ADHD be good? For example, why I ask this, or is it always bad? For example, in today's time, there is so much of context switching. In other words, people say multitasking, but you do multitasking in so many different things, and that is where this word called context switching has come in. And in today's time, many people are doing many things or many work at the same time. So you move on from one tool. Even in podcasting, you move on from one tool to another tool. Right now, I'm also going live on Rumble. So I'm trying to see whether that has gone. So my attention is that side, more on the technical side, less on the
Yeah.
content side. But it is okay. I am trying to understand this better so that the output is good. Many people have to do it. So how do you look at that? Is it
Yeah.
a good thing? Is it a bad thing in today's time? People who can switch context very quickly? Help us understand then that how should we look at? Should we relook at ADHD as a negative thing or a slightly positive thing? I want to understand.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it is very context dependent. It's you can think of it as like physical gifts. Like you could be really good at swimming, but not so good at basketball. You're gonna excel, of course, in swimming, and you're not gonna be so great at basketball. Same with uh, practically anything you can think. You can think of as it applies to humans. ADHD is not so great in some circumstances, some environments, and it could be incredibly valuable in other contexts. Uh, as executive coach who works with founders and executives, I can tell you that somebody with ADHD is 300% more likely to start a company, for example. Now, whether they're going to be able to make this company successful or not, that's a different question, and that's where a coach like me comes in to help support and come up with good strategies for working with ADHD rather than against it. But people with ADHD tend to be quite creative because they're able to see everything at the same time, and they can draw connections between things that other people might not notice. And they are also able to come up with solutions very quickly after like analyzing everything that they can perceive at the same time. I've been in so many conversations where I see something jumping right at me as an obvious solution to a problem, and I would bring it up, and and people would ignore it, and after 30 minutes of discussion and conversation, we would come to the same conclusion. So yeah, it could be a superpower if you can if you can learn to manage and harness it.
Right, right, George. Let me understand it from your example, and then I'll come to the other questions about entrepreneurship and leadership. One is that you were diagnosed with ADHD at the age of 47.
Yep.
And then earlier on, you call it a life of struggle and self doubt. So, did ADHD come to you in the form of knowing yourself better? And did that lead to better results for you? Help us understand. And can ADHD suddenly develop at any stage in life, or is it that it is part of your personality from very beginning, and but you realize it at
Yeah.
different stages in life?
Yeah, there's some research that shows that ADHD can in fact develop later, but it's very rare. Most cases of ADHD tend to be genetic, and so people are born with it, um, and there's no cure. It's I think it's not quite accurate to even think of it as something that could be cured. It's a different way of existing in the world. It's a different way for brains to work.
Right. Right, George. So now let's come to the leadership part and your entrepreneurship part. What do your clients, you are an executive coach. So, what do your clients, these leaders, come to you for? What is it that you can help them, which these talented people are not able to help themselves with?
Yeah, I support so-called twice exceptionals leaders. It's people who are profoundly gifted on one side of the spectrum, and disabled in some way on the other side of the spectrum. It could be ADHD or could be autism spectrum. Um, and both sides of the spectrum, both ends of the spectrum, require support. People who are profoundly gifted do not quite fit. People who don't quite have the full control of their ADHD do not quite fit. And my role in that relationship becomes to help to um, find a different way of experiencing the world. Almost, and I know it sounds quite dramatic, but it's very often that the transformation requires quite deep rethinking of your values, of how you see yourself in the world, and how you approach building relationships, interacting with other people. It's quite often very dramatic.
Right, right. So, what are the questions that they generally have of you in terms of the challenges that they face in their day-to-day life? Is it that their superhuman power, if it can be considered that way at different point, does that become a negative thing for them when they are, say, in a company, in a leadership position, in a workplace, or even in entrepreneurship? Because the type of people you will meet, the wavelength will be different. So help us understand the challenges that they generally share with you.
Yeah, so sometimes I work with people who are fairly new to their ADHD diagnosis, so they don't quite have the coping strategies, healthy coping strategies. If they have um, lived and became successful professionals um, through their 30s, 40s, and even later, they typically have developed some coping strategies, but they often not healthy and not productive. For example, it's very common for people with ADHD to use anxiety as a form of motivation. We'll procrastinate until the last moment, and then we'll do a work that a quote unquote normal person would need 5 days to complete. We'll do it in 3 hours before the meeting. And it's it works, but at the same time it also causes quite a bit of stress and anxiety. So being able to find a different strategy, externalize some of the skills that your brain is not quite able to perform itself, like paying attention to passage of time, for example, is one of the challenges that people with ADHD have. So we might find a way to use timers and alarms, and as trivial as it sounds, it's a big shift to go from I should be able to remember that I have a meeting in 5 minutes to admitting and acknowledging that should be does not apply in this case. When you have a disability, it's a disability. And it's there's a psychology doctor in the United States, Dr. Russell Barkley. He calls this a prosthetic environment. So creating that environment in which you can function with timers, with reminders, with alarm clocks, and making notes for yourself for later, or asking somebody else to remind you or hold you accountable. All of these little things create a huge difference in your life if you move past the should. Me, especially as a gifted person who possibly have been tested in school and in college as gifted, there's this idea that we have that if I am that smart, I should be able to remember that I have a meeting in 5 minutes. So moving past that way of thinking and relying more on external supports goes a very long way.
Right, right, George. So, why do they have to come to you? Why not a therapist? Many a times, uh, what's the difference if someone evaluates his or her position? What's the difference between going to either you or a therapist? Because it's a different situation altogether.
Yeah, it's such a good question. A lot of my clients also have a therapist. It's we play different roles. We provide different support to people. A therapist knows the diagnosis, knows the medication, knows the basic strategies. I know the business world, the leadership world, the tech world. I understand how Jira works, and I can suggest a different way of using it. So it's similar in some ways and different in a lot of ways as well. A coach, an executive coach, who, especially somebody who specializes in leadership and entrepreneurship, would understand, for example, a workplace dynamic better, how a conflict in a tech company might develop and unfold, and how to deal with it more effectively than a therapist might. Because I have experience and background in entrepreneurship and tech, it's also easier to have a conversation with me when we're talking about work and tech, because the client doesn't have to translate it into the language that a therapist would understand. To bring up Jira again, or continuous development, or whatever term might be relevant to the conversation.
Wonderful. Indeed. Indeed. So let's look at a workplace in terms of the boss. If he or she has this issue, less or more, how should they make sure that their leadership in workplace especially is not compromised in the way their mind functions. How can they look at it that way? Secondly, also for the employees, how do they know that the person they are actually dealing with is not a bad person, but actually have this sort of symptoms? So they do not have judgment, rather they
Yeah.
look at more collaboration with the supervisors or the leaders. How can that happen best?
Yeah, it has to come from the leadership, the support, the goodwill, the curiosity. And it has to come from the leadership that supports and creates the culture that is accepting and supporting for people with ADHD or any type of neurodiversity. ADHD is one of many. Um, does that answer your question? I
Yes,
really
yes,
like
yes.
your question.
No, 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 no. This is perfectly all right. There is no right or wrong. I'm just trying to delve deep into your, mind and get as best as possible
Yeah,
for the, because there is no right or wrong. It's all about perspective, George. Even I don't know. It can be very difficult uh, in these situations because on the practical level, everything might be different in different situations and different workplaces. So, for a person who is a gifted person, in a
mhm.
nutshell, how should they just take their day-to-day life? Like, what is the difference, even in your case, before the age of 47 and after 47? How have you tried to take your life forward in terms of work better, and what has that been your transformation after that diagnosis?
Yeah. The biggest change that I had to make for myself, and something that I teach to my clients as well, is to start with self-compassion, especially for later diagnosed people who have lived with struggle and shame. You have to start with self-compassion to begin this healing, to self-acceptance. I'm forgetting now who said this. Probably Carl Jung, as always. Um, Only when you accept yourself as you are, with all the quirks and flaws, only then you can start to change. Um, that's the first place where you have to look. Then second, I already mentioned relying on external supports. Could be people. It could be technology. I have never go anywhere without Siri. I never leave a kettle on the stove without setting a timer on my watch first, because I don't want to burn down my house. And I use notebooks. Never leave house without a notebook, because if I need to remember something, I have to externalize it. I have to put it in writing somewhere. Um, Prosthetic environment. Coming back to this phrase, um, people, family, friends, their support and their understanding play a huge role. And I had this conversation just a couple of days ago with somebody about disclosure. Should I disclose my diagnosis at work or not? And I argue that if you're in a leadership position, if you have nominal or positional power, if you have some kind of authority, and at less danger of being mistreated, I would argue you should disclose your diagnosis to normalize it to other people, to
Right.
create the environment where it's understandable and
Right.
okay um, to have ADHD, and also show how you support by asking for the right accommodations for yourself, and making it okay for other people to ask for accommodations for them.
Absolutely. That's a good point you made, so that, employees also can adjust their working style with your working style, and that can bring a lot of change to the productivity and output. There is much to understand about these things, George, and I'm sure a lot of people would want to understand more about how you do things. A lot of people who would want to take your help, they would also like to understand more about you. So, what is the best way for them to connect with you?
It's sudarkoff.com is my website. There's a newsletter if they want to follow my writing, or look me up on LinkedIn. I'm the only Sudarkoff on LinkedIn, so quite easy.
Wonderful. With this, it's a wrap on this very special edition of the KAJ Masterclass Live. Thank you so much indeed for joining us.
Thank you.